Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Thank you for tuning in for another storytelling night. If you're unfamiliar with this series, it's ongoing. It is a monthly series that we run here at Caffe Lena, and typically in pre-COVID times, this would be an open mic where we had a featured storyteller who would have about a half-hour set, and then the rest would be filled up by anyone from the community that wanted to come and share a story. And since we started doing these live streams again, we have transitioned to a format where some of our featured storytellers from that series come back, and we present 3 at a time. So each storyteller tonight will have about a half an hour. They will fill that up with maybe some longer stories, maybe a series of shorter ones. But it's always a really fun time. There are some old traditional stories. There are some originals. It's always a great mix. One thing I want to mention is we've had a last-minute change to our lineup tonight. Kate Dudding is not feeling well. It appears that it's just a cold, but in line with our screening process and just with general precautions right now, she is staying home, and Jeannine Laverty is going to be telling in her place tonight. So we're going to Betty Cassidy behind me, and then we have Sandor Schuman, and Jeannine is going to close out the night tonight. So make sure you say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. If you've been a storyteller yourself, maybe share when the last time you were here. And then make sure you also visit the virtual tip jar that we have on your screen. It's going to be over here somewhere, and I will send it in the chat a couple times, and it's all split between tonight's storytellers and the cafe, so it really helps us keep these live streams going when we get support from everybody watching. So thank you for being here, and have a wonderful night.
How long time? I'm delighted to be here. I haven't been in this program so far, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry Kate will be missing it, but I'm delighted also to have her partner, her other person who is taking her place, is Jeannine. I have a couple of fairly short stories to tell because they were favorite stories of mine, and I think they sort of fit in with things that are going on today. I like to tell historical stories, but I only like to tell the ones that I see could make a connection with what's happening in our world. So the first story. Sam was a handsome young man. And he was educated, and he was smart, and he had a great job, and everything was going wonderfully for him, but he got very ill all of a sudden. Now, Sam was only about 23 years old, and we're talking about him living at the time of 1920, perhaps, at that era. So he was very ill. All his mother's ideas about what would cure him didn't work. He had pains and aches and temperature problems, and they went from doctor to doctor to doctor. Now, this was the time when a lot of people had tuberculosis. So they were surprised that no doctor would say Sam had. He didn't have it. He had something that might have looked like it, but it wasn't tuberculosis. Finally, they found a doctor, a new one, who came and said, well, all those doctors were right because he doesn't have tuberculosis, but some of the treatment they do for tuberculosis might be good for him. People often go up into the Adirondacks, and they get used to that fresh water and the air and the rest, and somehow that helps cure them. Well, Sam's mother just had to hear that, and he was on the train the next day going up to North Creek. And he got to this little town, got out, and he was met by Mrs. Martin, who had a boarding house where he stayed. Now, when he got there, she said, "Now, Sam, you just take it easy. I'll bring your food up to you, and when you feel like getting out, you come out." Well, he didn't feel like getting out for a long time, it seemed, but it was only 3 or 4 days. And then he finally went down the stairs, and he finally was able to stay and eat with the people who also lived in this place. And slowly, he got feeling a little bit better. And he got so he would go out on the porch and sit there as on a sunny day and watch all the people going by. And he was a little surprised, though, because everybody seemed to know him. The little kids on the way to school would say, "Hi, Mr. Sam." And the mailman would be talking to him. And other people who were coming to visit would always say they knew him, and they were glad to see he looked better. And he said to Mrs. Martin, "How do all these people know anything about me?" And she said, "Well, this is a small town, you know. And it's very poor now. We're in what they call a Great Depression, too. And none of the men have jobs much, and everybody's sort of just hanging around. And they all know what's going on all over town." "Oh," said Sam. And he continued to get a little better and a little better and a little better until he could walk with the mailman once in a while, just take a little walk with him. And he went along one day with him all the way around his route almost. That was a real victory. Sam was getting better and better and better. He even learned how to go fishing with all of his new friends, and he learned how to paddle a canoe, and he did a little hunting with them and a little climbing. Everything was just amazing. Well, he was very happy there. But after about 3 months, it was time. Time for him to go back home, time for him to go back to work and get back in the real world again. But he hated to leave all his new friends, and all the people there were sorry to see him go. So he said, "Look, I'll come back at Christmas, and I'll see you all then. I'll be here for a day or so just before Christmas." Well, the adults in the group thought, well, he'll never bother with that once he gets home again. But he did. He was there for Christmas. And before he came, he had called and talked to the minister of that town and said, "I'd like to bring some things up. Some of those kids looked like they could have some clothes that were a little bit warmer. How many people do you think could use some better clothes?" And the minister just laughed and said, "All of them." So Sam brought 2 great big cartons full of mittens and scarves and hats and even a few pairs of boots, and he gave them to the minister to distribute. Everyone had a great time, and they were all very happy when Sam said, "I'll come back next year. I really miss all you people." And as usual, the adults said he probably won't make it. He's got other things going. But Sam was back the second year, and he had more and more things he brought for people because he had really looked around and paid attention and realized how poor these people were at this time. And every Christmas after that, he kept coming back, and every time it was with more and more and more and more and more things that the people needed. And he got so most of it was things that would fit the kids. And he would bring them books and games and things they never had the chance to use. One year, around the 7th time he went, he brought boxes of warm blankets. One little girl came up to him the next day and said, "Oh, Mr. Sam, I never slept that good. I always woke up and was cold. That blanket was so nice." And Sam felt good about that. Well, this continued year after year until around 1940-41. The world had changed by then. We were into World War II problems. People couldn't get away from their jobs now because they had work to do. Sam could not take a whole bunch of stuff on a railroad car because it was all needed for transportations for the war. So Sam, on his last time there, it was like a holiday. The last week that he went, the last Christmas. The kids had made signs and put them on the outside of the little house where the train pulled into. Some of the kids by then had learned how to play a guitar or something, and they would sing and come and entertain. The other kids would sing also if they couldn't play anything. And everyone had a wonderful, wonderful time. And you know, when you look back on this and think about this man who did this for at least 11 years in gratitude for the way these people had taken care of him, well, that's almost a lifetime for some of these little kids. And you know, when they think of Christmas, ever since then, ever after that time, you can be sure they weren't thinking about, you know, Santa Claus and the reindeer going by. Santa Claus is that chubby little guy. No, they were thinking of the train pulling up with this tall, skinny man who wore a long, heavy black raincoat and a big hat and gloves and big boots and had glasses with dark rims. That was Mr. Sam, and he was their Santa Claus. So, thank you. We have, this next story is a personal story that is not always cheerful, but it's turned out to be one of my favorite stories because it tells of how I learned a lot about something. My sister and I were never told by anyone who saw us and didn't know who we were, never told, "Oh, you're sisters, you look so much alike," because we looked like nothing like alike. My sister was 3 years younger than me, and she was taller and slim, and she had beautiful dark hair, almost black, and a face shaped like a heart shape. She was a very pretty young woman. I was sort of the chunky one. I was the kind that they looked at and said, "Oh, she's very healthy," you know. But we got along because besides not looking alike, our personalities were not alike either. My sister Bonnie was quiet and peaceful kind of thing, and she had a few friends, but it was kind of, she was also spending a lot of time herself, and she liked music and reading and things like that. I was always the loudmouth one, the busy one, and I was involved in lots of activities and things. But, you know, it was funny. Somehow, even as little kids, we adjusted to that. We knew that we were very different. We knew that we would never look at things the same way, but it worked out okay because Bonnie was that way and I was this way, and so what? Now, as we grew older and time passed, and we got married and had kids and moved away and didn't see one another very often, except maybe at a family picnic or my mother and father having a big party for Thanksgiving or something, when we would all get together, but that would involve aunts and uncles and cousins and little kids and babies and teenagers and everything. So Bonnie and I never had a chance to really sit down and connect with one another. Well, her husband died quite young, and so she was widowed. And then I decided, well, I think it's time Bonnie and I spend more time together. So I invited her to come and visit with me. It was about a 4-hour ride from her house to mine. But she said no, she didn't want to. So when I went up to see her, I tried to spend more time than I usually had. I usually spent most of my time with my parents. But I would be talking to Bonnie and watching her and thinking, I don't really get it. How does she live that way? Because Bonnie had lived in a lovely little house in a little town, but she was right living in a portion of this town. I would look at it and think it was like 6 blocks here and 3 blocks here, all the way around in a square. And now this was all right because she didn't drive. She had never driven. So was a place where she could walk to almost everything. And luckily, she could get to, there was a little grocery store and a drugstore and I think a dentist nearby and a hardware store, all the things that someone might need to walk to. And she was there doing that in that space, and I would think, I would crack up if I lived there, where you're just in this little spot and hardly ever went anywhere else and doesn't want to go anywhere else. But it was like when we were kids. That was her, and this was me. And we were very different, and we were going to get together anyway and ignore these differences. Well, one day I got a phone call from Bonnie's daughter who lived in the same town, and she said, Betty, I thought you probably would want to know this, but Bonnie is in. We took her last night to Vermont to go to a medical place to be find out what's wrong with her. Well, I said, what happened? And she said, well, she couldn't breathe. And we took her to a local hospital, but there were no people there, a specialist for that. So they hooked her up to some oxygen and took her to this place. Now, but don't worry about it. She's had 3 tests on various parts of her, things about her lungs already, and she's passed every one of them, I think. So we're hoping, this new doctor is coming tomorrow, and we're hoping he'll find out what really caused this, and then she'll be able to go home. Okay. Well, the next day, she was able to go home. The doctor, this new doctor, had said she should go home. But she should go home because she had a very rare lung disease, one for which there was no cure, and she might live 4 months completely attached to oxygen. So I decided I better get up to her house and see her soon. And driving up, I was getting a little nervous. I'm really terrible about medical things. I end up trying to be too cheerful, and I couldn't go in there and say, oh, you're looking great. And you look like you're getting better, because that was a lie. That isn't true with her. But I drove into the driveway, and Bonnie's daughter was standing in the door saying, hurry up, Betty. She wants to see you before the movie starts. And I went racing in there, and there's Bonnie in this hospital bed, and the TV is on, and it's one of those old movies. And she's saying, Betty, we saw this movie when we were kids. Don't you remember? If we each had a quarter, we could walk to the movie theater. And you always took me with you when you went. And we went to those movies, and you could stay through 2 movies, and she went on, raving about them. And we watched this movie. It was terrible as a movie. But it was one of these, I don't know if any of you remember someone called Margaret O'Hara. Maureen O'Hara, who was a beautiful Irish girl. And John Wayne was probably the husband at some point. And they were suffering about everything all the way through the movie. Somebody was down in a mine, or somebody was being chased, or somebody lost their job, and the children were falling apart, or had things like this happening to them. And then by the end, however, they always ended with this whole lovely little family at sunset, and they were all healthy looking, and Maureen O'Hara's hair was beautiful, and her dress was perfect, and there wasn't a spot on it, even after all this torture. Well, we started talking then about some of these movies as we remembered them, and all of a sudden I remembered I was here because Bonnie was so sick. What's going on? And I thought, she's in charge. She's taking charge of this. She doesn't want to talk about illness. She doesn't want to talk about her disease. She wants to do this. Well, that was good. 2 weeks later, I went back to see her again, and her daughter met me at the door this time and said, well, it's a different thing now. We've got something going on. And I said, what? And she said, well, Bonnie has decided she wants to get rid of all her books. And she had lots of them. We found boxes of them down in the basement that we forgot were even there. Now, anyone who comes to see her, and a lot of people did during her illness, anyone who comes to see her has to go and pick out a book first. And then they can go into her and bring the book and tell her why they chose it. And then she would sign it, and they would go. I said, well, that's a new idea. Has it started yet? And her daughter said, well, yes. To my surprise, it's very popular. Why, the woman down the street, Mrs. Carson, she and Bonnie were not close friends, but once in a while they'd talk about cooking because they both loved to cook. She was one of the first one to come. And she looked and she found a cookbook that she had wanted for years. It had to do with pastries and pie crust and things, I guess. And she took that into Bonnie, and they talked about it. And they talked about cooking, and Bonnie signed it saying something like, happy meals to you. And Mrs. Carson was happy as could be. And some of Diane's friends, her daughter's friends who were teachers, brought their kids over because there were lots of children's books, and they picked out wonderful ones. And this is really, really going strong. The only one they had a problem with, her daughter told me, was one of the friends that had been a neighbor since he was about 3 years old up to now when he was about 20. And he had been a friend of all of their kids and in and out of the house all those years. And he felt very close to Bonnie, and he wanted to see her. But he also didn't like to read. He didn't like school. He right now was trying to figure out what to do with his life or what not to do, because he'd get a job and he'd decide it wasn't for him and quit. But he really was serious about wanting to see Bonnie. But everyone said, no, you can't unless you get a book. I don't have a book. You'll find a book right here. Well, he was fairly smart in one way. He knew he would look for the smallest book. And he found a little tiny one. It wasn't much bigger than a brochure. And it was about the St. Lawrence Seaway. Now, this house where they all lived was right on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. So at least he had heard of that. And it made a connection when he saw a book. And he brought that book into Bonnie, and they had a long talk about the St. Lawrence Seaway. And she signed it, and he took the book home. Well, books left that house, and Bonnie signed as long as she could. But the day came almost exactly 4 months after She had seen that doctor, and she died. About 7 months after that was the first time I had seen any of her family since the funeral. So I saw Diane and said, "What's happened with the books? Did anything happen afterwards?" She said, "Oh my gosh," she said, "it's still going on. I can't go to the supermarket without someone waving me saying, 'Hey, I just borrowed one of your mother's books from someone,' or 'I'm reading this great book that was your mother's.'" And lots and lots of people have enjoyed those books. But I'll tell you, the one that was the most important one, the one who liked it the most, was this kid who got the book about the St. Lawrence Seaway. Something connected with him when he read about it, and he realized he lived right in the banks of this river. He got so that he went, for the first time that he ever could go on his own, he went to the library, and he found another book, and he was actually reading it. And his mother said, "I can't believe it. You know, he has signed up to take a course at the local community college, just a course on local history. I never thought he would even touch a book. Thanks to Bonnie, he's reading and he's going to school. I am so happy." I think the story turns out to be full of joy. And I think it was a good lesson for me, because I was thinking, I wouldn't want to live that way in that 5 by 6 or whatever it was, those blocks of land with no real place to go, and just being in the same over and over and over walk every day, and so forth and so forth. Because you see, what I learned from that, which I should have known, but I think what all of us knew her, felt this a little bit, that we couldn't possibly travel to all the places we'd like to be in, except if we went with Bonnie's books. Okay? I don't know if I have any more time. Is my hour up? I would just like to spend a minute to say how that those two stories, I'm reminded of people who do things when they've had problems, and do things and recover and help other people, because some of that may be going on today. What else is going on today, though, that I would like to warn people about is that I hear more and more people say they hate their masks because they can't hear well with them on. But that's not exactly true. I think it's just possibly because we don't practice enough or something. But we already know how to do some of this stuff. It's just like we're finding now. We're finding now that if we know we already do something, then perhaps what's going on in our world today won't seem so difficult. For example, there's a lot of things that happen that we can't understand the language when someone's speaking to us because of a mask. It happens because we just aren't listening well, or we don't hear it well. Let me give you one quick example. One of them is that one day my husband and I had been going somewhere, and I said, "Let's stop for lunch. I've heard that place over there is a good one." And we went in to sit down, ordered our lunch from the young man who was working there. And he said, "Well, my waitress is a cook today, and she'll bring the lunch out in just a minute." And she did. A minute later, she came out like this and walking along this, and she came right to where I was sitting, and she took one look at me, and she said, "Ah, you look just like my dead aunt." I'm not sure, even today, what that is about. But I have another example that I'm still not sure about, too, that I am trying to learn from. I was volunteering for quite some time at the Saratoga Library. When they would have people as greeters, you just sat there and chatted with someone when they came in, tried to make them feel comfortable. And one day, this woman came in and was standing there over in the corner, sort of, and staring my way, but I didn't pay any attention. And then she came up right in front of me and said, "What's your name?" Well, nobody asks you that. I had a little sign that said volunteer. I said, "Well, you mean I'm a volunteer? I don't care about that. What's your name?" And I said, well, to myself, well, it can't hurt to tell her my name. I said, "My name is Betty." "That's not what I mean. What's your last name?" So I told her. And I'm beginning to wonder what's going on here. And then she said, "Were you a teacher?" And then I had one of those moments. I said, "Yes." But, every once in a while, before I retired, when I was a teacher all the time, I would once in a while think, I hope I never did anything to hurt somebody or say the wrong thing to a kid at the wrong time. With enough students you dealt with, you probably did once. But I hope I've always been good that way. So when she said, "Were you a teacher?" and I had to say yes. And she said, "Where? Did you teach at the community college?" I said, "Yes." And I'm getting more and more nervous now about the whole thing. And she said, "I've got something to tell you." "Okay, I'm ready. Tell me." And she looked right at me and she said, "You made a difference." And then she turned around and walked out of the door, walked right out of the library. Now, the librarian who works there was standing right near me during this conversation, and she said, "Was that a compliment?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm not sure." But you see, nowadays, I've changed my tune. I figure if the whole world is fading around us, we've got to find some way to be alert and ready to handle things, just as our people did in the past when things got bad. So I have decided to change it a little bit. If someone else asks me, "Was that a compliment?" I'm going to say, "I think so. Thank you." Now you have a very special attempt, a very special time in our next teller. Sandy is going to be here, and he's got his musical instrument and he has wonderful stories. Thank you. Okay.
I would like to tell you a story I call A Mother's Christmas Warning. Erwin Gillespie was the youngest of 9 children. It was a poor family in Covington, Kentucky. The father made his living as a painter, but he was an alcoholic and drank up a good part of his earnings. To keep the family alive, the oldest daughter quit school so she could take care of the younger kids and her mother could go out and work. In spite of their poverty, the family was musical. It seemed each of them played some kind of instrument. And Irwin Gillespie, the baby of the family, took up the piano. And he decided he wanted to be a professional musician. Now, to join the musicians' union as a young man, he had to learn how to read and write music, and so he took classes, and he joined the union. He had a regular job performing on the Island Queen, the paddle wheeler that went up and down the Ohio River from Cincinnati. By day, he played the calliope and entertained the guests. In the evening, he led his dance band for everyone there to enjoy. He was not the only one in the family who was successful in the music business. His older brother, Haven, was actually a typesetter. He worked as a printer for the big newspapers. He had worked in Chicago and New York, but he also wrote songs. And in the 1920s, his songs sold so well that he quit the printing business and devoted himself full-time to writing songs. In fact, it was his younger brother, Irwin, who helped him learn how to play the piano. And in large families, it's often the case that an older sibling and a younger sibling kind of team up, and well, all the siblings in that family were close, but Haven and Irwin were especially close. Well, even though he had all those successes as a songwriter in the 20s, in the 30s, early 30s, not so much. And he didn't like Chicago or New York, even though New York was where all the music publishers were. So he lived in his hometown with all the other siblings in Covington, Kentucky. And he would make the trip periodically to New York to sell his songs. Well, in 1934, he was ready to make that trip. He was going to meet his collaborator, Fred Coots, who wrote the music, and they were going to try to sell their songs to their publisher, Leo Feist, one of the biggest publishers in the country, in New York City. But as he was ready to go to New York, his baby brother got sick, really sick. He had an infectious lung disease. I'm detecting a pattern here in the stories. So Haven stayed home to be with his brother, who died. He died at the age of 40 with a wife and a young child. The whole family was in grief, and especially Haven, who was so close to Irwin. Right after the funeral, though, Haven left. Maybe he was so grief-stricken he just couldn't stand being with his family in this horrible moment. Maybe Fred Coots was already waiting for him in New York. He didn't want to keep him. Maybe he really needed the money. Anyway, right after the funeral, he went to New York. He and Fred Coots went on the subway from the hotel to Leo Feist Publishing. They got there. The publisher was excited to see them. We need a song. Here's the publisher. They're coming in to sell their songs, and the publisher wants Haven to write a new song. We need a Christmas song, something light and cheery for children. Haven had written some successful children's songs, and that's why the publisher wanted him in particular to do this song. And Haven was in no mood. He resisted. Why would you want to write a Christmas song? It's good for a few weeks, and then it's gone. And my brother just died. I am in no mood to write a cheery, lighthearted song. But the publisher was insistent. And so on their way back to the hotel, Fred Coots and Haven Gillespie are looking at the advertisements on the walls of the subway car, trying to look for inspiration. Fred is at one end of the car, Haven's at the other, and Haven can only think of his brother and his family, and he's trying to think of some Christmas song. And he remembers his mother warning the younger children around Christmas time, trying to keep them in line while she's busy with all the holiday preparations. You better behave if you want Santa to bring you any presents. You had better do your chores if you want Santa to come. Well, you can probably figure out what song that recollection inspired. And by the time the subway had landed at the station and they got to the hotel, Haven Gillespie had pretty much finished all the words to this song. It took a couple of days more for Fred Coots to write the music. Now, how the song got to Eddie Cantor, well, there's a couple of different versions. Eddie Cantor, the star of vaudeville, star of Hollywood movies, star of his nationally broadcast radio program. One version says that Eddie Cantor was looking for a Christmas song for his Thanksgiving radio show. He tried to write a Christmas song himself, and he had written some songs, so this was not too far a stretch, but he wasn't happy with the product. And so he started calling various music publishers in town. Do you have a Christmas song for me? No. None of them had a Christmas song for Eddie Cantor. He called Leo Feist, and Leo Feist said, sure, we have a Christmas song. It needs a few finishing touches. We'll have it to you by the end of the week. Of course, they didn't have anything at all, and probably that's why they were so pressuring Haven Gillespie to write one, because they already had a customer. Well, that's one version of the story. The other version is that Leo Feist had the song, it was already written, and they're looking for somebody to sing it, somebody to perform it. And they offered it to all the big names, and they all turned it down. It's too silly, it's too childish, it's too corny. You're gonna kill Christmas with that song. Well, Fred Coots had been writing music for Eddie Cantor's radio show, and so he had a little bit of an in with Eddie Cantor, and he showed him the song. Eddie Cantor didn't like it either. It was too childish, too silly, too corny. But his wife liked it, Ida. And Ida convinced Eddie Cantor to perform the song on his Thanksgiving show. It sold 25,000 copies of sheet music a day from Thanksgiving past Christmas, and became one of the most frequently performed, biggest selling Christmas songs of all time. But Haven Gillespie couldn't listen to it. It brought him such heartache because it reminded him of his little brother Erwin and how he so unfortunately died. Now, I think if Haven Gillespie were still alive, he would take that song and he'd put some new words to it. And in my imagination, it would sound something like this. Oh, you better not cough, you better not sneeze, you better stay away, I'm begging you please. COVID might be hiding in you. You better mask up and stay away 6 feet or more, health experts say. COVID might be hiding in you. It knows if you've been masking and covered mouth and nose. It knows if you've been distancing from friends as well as foes. Oh, on a shopping cart, your phone or cup, it sticks around, so please wash up. COVID-19's lurking around. You won't know where it's lurking. It hangs around by stealth. But if it gets into your lungs, it's a bad thing for your health. Oh, you're in a big crowd. You're flirting with death. Take my advice. Don't take a breath. COVID-19's lurking around. You don't know where it's lurking. It may not make you ill, but others not so lucky. That virus they could kill. So I'd better not cough, I'd better not sneeze, I'd better stay away, not spread this disease. COVID might be hiding in me. Well, I'm going to shift themes gracelessly and tell you a story that I call The Land Beyond Law. This story requires a little bit of geographic explication. So here's New York State. Directly to the east of New York State is Massachusetts. And there's a border between them, which is defined by the Taconic Mountains. It's a natural, physical border. It made sense in the 1700s when the colonies were formalizing their boundaries. It made sense to say, well, let's just have a straight line right through the Taconic Mountains. And if you look at a real map, I realize that this one might be lacking in accuracy. You'll see that it's a straight line that goes right down the middle of the Taconic Mountains. But here was the problem. You see, the Taconic Mountains, which are formidable, this is the Taconic Ridge. If you haven't seen this from Route 22 in New York or even closer, Under Mountain Road, that physical wall, if you've never seen it, if you've seen Game of Thrones, picture the North Wall, that's what it looks like. It's impassable. But it doesn't go straight. Just as it gets close to the Connecticut border, here's Massachusetts, here's Connecticut, there's the border, it heads east a little bit into Massachusetts. And so that means here's the border between New York and Massachusetts, here's the mountains, here's the border between Massachusetts and Connecticut. There's this little triangle here. Well, how can I do that? Little triangle of land that's part of the state of Massachusetts, but it's on the wrong side of the Taconic Ridge. And you can't go over the ridge, over the mountain, and you can't go around it. So they're isolated. In a bit of geographic humor, it became known as Boston Corner. I think because it's as far as you can get from the city of Boston and still be in the state of Massachusetts. Boston Corner. It's only 1,000 acres or so, 500 of which are in the mountains, and then there's this lowland, good farmland. Well, this wasn't much of a problem in the 1700s because nobody lived there. But as settlers started coming in, it did become a problem. you'll recognize it if I just kind of walk you through it. Let's just say you're an outlaw. You're a thief. You're stealing horses in Saratoga Springs, where they have some very nice horses, and you're trying to get away from the law. Where do you go? Someplace where the law isn't going to find you. You go to Boston Corner because that's in the Massachusetts jurisdiction. But the Massachusetts law isn't going to come over the mountain to get you. They're not going to come around the mountain to get you. You're pretty much safe from the law. And the New York authorities, although they're accessible to that area, they don't have jurisdiction. So it's the land beyond law. Well, this became just an unworkable situation for the 20 families who lived now in Boston Corners, farming families. And in the 1840s, they petitioned the legislature. They said essentially, look, we feel like orphans here. We pay our taxes, we are members of the family, but yet we get no parental help or guidance. We want out. We're whatever assistance we can find is from New York. So we want to become part of New York. Well, it took 5 years of petitioning. Finally, the Massachusetts legislature agreed to release this land. The New York State legislature agreed to accept this land. But it took 2 more years for the U.S. Congress to approve the deal. And if it wasn't a land enough behind the law, beyond the law before, it was now, because Massachusetts had essentially washed its hands, not our responsibility. New York couldn't because it still wasn't in New York. Prize fighting was illegal in both states, and yet prize fighting was very popular. So some promoters put together a prize fight, a championship prize fight. And where did they locate it? It was going to be held in Boston Corners. It was illegal, but who had jurisdiction? Nobody. They advertised, big posters, take the New York Harlem River Railroad to Boston Corners. The Harlem River Railroad had just been extended from New York City up past Boston Corners, and there was a station stop in Boston Corners. How convenient. 5,000 people showed up. Rowdy men from New York to watch this prize fight. Now, Yankee Sullivan was the current American champion. He was an experienced boxer, 40 years old. His opponent was John Morrissey, a young man from Troy, New York. His experience fighting was mostly from barroom brawls. He was 22 years old in one account, 28 years old in another account. In any case, 12 or 18 years younger than Yankee Sullivan. Taller by several inches, heavier by many pounds, younger, stronger. He had the nickname Old Smoke. Now you might ask, how does a young man in his 20s get the nickname Old Smoke? Well, in one of those barroom brawls, he and his opponent knocked over the coal stove, and the coal embers were scattered on the floor. His opponent knocked him down and pressed his back into those burning coals. And John Morrissey wrenched himself up from the floor and beat the bejesus out of that guy with the coals burning in his back and smoke arising from his flesh. Old Smoke. Well, of course, this wouldn't have ever happened except for that mistake, you could say, by those surveyors. Well, the surveyors aren't the ones who made the mistake. It was the people who agreed on that straight line border through the Taconics. You know, sometimes you get that sort of thing right, and sometimes you don't. In this case, they didn't get it right, but they didn't find that out until the surveyors got there. And so we find ourselves in the ring, Sullivan versus Morrissey. The fight went 37 rounds. And this fight was covered in newspapers all across the country, round by round, round one, round two, and so on, with a detailed description of what happened. And most of those descriptions would lead you to believe that Yankee Sullivan, the older, more experienced, though smaller and older boxer, Yankee Sullivan was winning the fight. There's a description of John Morrissey in the second to the last round that makes you think he's just a lump of walking flesh. His eyes are swollen. He can barely see. He's staggering. He's losing his balance. And then the 37th round. Somehow, now there are varying descriptions and they're not entirely consistent, so I'm going to summarize one such account. Somehow John Morrissey gets his arm around the neck of Sullivan and lifts Sullivan off of the floor. And they're against the ropes. And somehow Sullivan maneuvers himself out of this hold. Now, in one account, it's Morrissey's seconds, the guys in his corner, his assistants. It's Morrissey's seconds who figure there's been some foul play here, and they jump into the ring to come to Morrissey's assistance. In another account, it's Sullivan's seconds who jump into the ring, and chaos ensues. The seconds are fighting with each other. People in the audience are jumping in. The referee calls the fighters to the scratch, the starting point in the center of the ring. And they're required by the rules to come to the scratch. Well, Morrissey hears the call and he extricates himself from this mass of fighting and stands on the scratch. Sullivan either didn't hear or he's just too busy defending his buddies and punching his way around. He doesn't come to the scratch. The referee waits the required time and then some, and then awards the fight to Morrissey because he came to the scratch and Sullivan didn't. And that's when the riot broke out. Now, papers that hadn't even covered the fight actually covered the riot. It was the rowdy city folk destroying the gentle farm community. It had a lot of appeal across the country as a story. Both Sullivan and Morrissey were fined for criminal activity violating the law against prize fighting. Sullivan skipped town and found his way to California. 2.5 years later, he was arrested for ballot fixing. He had been hired by some political party to intimidate people who might vote for the wrong candidate. And he was arrested, put in jail, and 4 days later, he was found dead. It was claimed to be a suicide, but many suspected it was the political cronies who didn't want him to squeal and made sure that he couldn't. John Morrissey, on the other hand, paid the fine, went back to his hometown, Troy, got into the gambling casino business, and did pretty well. He later on served 2 terms in Congress and 2 terms in the New York State Senate. But before any of that happened, in August of 1863, he organized a horse race, a meet that lasted for 4 days. Now, here I am in Saratoga Springs. I don't need to say much more to the locals than August 1863, and they know what I'm talking about. Because the next year, that race meet was so successful that the next year, 1864, Morrissey got together with a wealthy lawyer from New York City, William Travers, and they bought 125 acres and built the Saratoga Race Course, which has been running horse races ever since. Now, we remember William Travers because there's the Travers Stakes that runs every August, the best-known single race in the Saratoga season. Morrissey isn't remembered so much, but if you go to the Adelphi Hotel in downtown Saratoga Springs, it was recently refurbished, and if you want a drink, you go to the bar. It's called the Morrissey Lounge. And if you look at the drinks menu, you'll see a rather pricey drink that's called Old Smoke. If you'll join me there, I'll allow you to buy me one. Now, there's one more thing you can do, and that's to go to Boston Corners, and you'll drive along Under Mountain Road, and there's that ominous Taconic Range on one side, and on the other side is this farm field, and there's a historical marker, a New York State historical marker. And it says, prize fight, Sullivan versus Morrissey, October 5th, 1883. Well, it wasn't October 5th, it was October 12th, and it wasn't 1883, it was 1853. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes not. Well, I have the pleasure now of graciously shifting gears once again to introduce Jeannine Laverty, who needs no introduction, so I won't.
Thank you, Joe. Ugh. Well, I have to say that, sometimes storytellers are practicing their stories while the other storytellers are telling. And my stories have gone completely out of my head because of Sandy and Betty's amazing stories. It's just such a pleasure to be here. Although, Kate, if you're watching, we are sorry that you're not here. And I'm going to try to make a little transition from your spirit on this stage into mine, although I don't have a lot of confidence that it's going to work. But Kate Dudding really loves silly jokes. That's what she calls them. They're riddles, but Kate calls them silly jokes. And she would never tell them first, and she doesn't tell them from the stage, she tells them, when you're saying goodbye and you think you've said goodbye, then Kate says, "Oh." And so you stop and listen to her silly joke. So today, through her coughing and stuffy nose, she said to me at the end of our phone call, "So, silly joke of the day." I'm terrible at telling jokes. I have to say that, which is why it's very hard for me. But it's very interesting to try to be Kate. Anyway, she says, "So, silly joke for the day. How can you tell that Santa Claus is good at karate?" I'm listening to my storytelling partners because...
He's got a black belt.
Yes, I knew that Sandy would be able to figure it out.
I heard
That's...
it from Kate.
Oh, you bug, you didn't say that earlier. Well, anyway, yes. So for those of you who didn't hear, you can tell because he has a black belt. And maybe you figured it out, but not only am I bad at telling jokes, but I can never figure them out, and riddles. And so I always just right away say to Kate, "I don't know. Why did Santa? How can you tell?" You see. Anyway, so Kate, we're with you, and you're with us. Well, one of the things I was thinking while I was listening to Betty and listening to Sandy was how much we all owe to librarians. All those different endings about John Morrissey and Boston Corners, all those different things that Sandy has joyfully read and found and shared with us. And that wonderful, benevolent person up in the Adirondacks. Betty looked at a lot of newspaper clippings and various things preserved in libraries, I bet you. I don't know. Anyway, I've owed so much to librarians in my life, both as a teacher and as a storyteller. They've led me down paths that I would never go. And this first story was created by a librarian for some students who were studying the Middle Ages. And she says they were going at it hammer and tongs. They were building catapults. They were doing all kinds of things. But this librarian wanted them to have things they could perform or tell. And I'm so glad she did that, because the thing about telling a story about somebody else is that it's the best way to get closest to that person when you bring their words, their being, through your being. It's one of the joyous things about being a storyteller. So this story, and I'm sorry, but I have to say, when you've told stories for a long time, every story that you tell carries people with it that the story reminds you of, or that you think what the person would say about that story. I'm going to tell you a story about a sheep. We're almost there. And in my life of being a farm worker, I have some friends who raised goats. And my friends had very little good to say about sheep. And in the winters when I was farm sitting for those goats, they made a fool of me all the time. They are so smart and so clever and so naughty. And indeed, I thought, yes, sheep are really dull. And then I remembered that when I was a little kid, my grandfather in Iowa, across the field, he had sheep, and I don't remember anything about those sheep except that there was one sheep that was injured and came and stayed in our chicken yard while he was recovering, and I was still pretty little. And that little sheep, as it got feeling better, was constantly butting me in the butt. And so those are some of the things I was thinking about when I got working on this story. This story is called Alice the Shepherdess. Alice the Shepherdess says, "My mother died the day I was born, and so I was suckled by a sheep. My father says that made me more sheep than human. And it's true, maybe, really. I mean, I've been with sheep all my life. First, I drank their milk, and then I ate their meat, and then I washed their fleece, and then I carded their wool, and now that I'm older, I help with the lambing. Because even though I'm older, my hands are still pretty small, which is a good thing to have if you have to reach inside a sheep to help with the lamb. Jilly is my favorite of all the sheep. She's my sister. We drank milk from the same sheep. Now, lots of sheep, they just don't care one way or another. But Jilly, she is so sweet of heart. I just love the feel of her chin in my hand. And I just love the smell of my fingers after I've put them in her thick, soft wool. One morning in early spring, I woke up in the straw in the barn, and I knew something was wrong. Jilly, what is it? Jilly just looked at me with the blank, dark eyes of a beast in pain. I got up and went around behind Jilly. I lifted up her tail, and there was the head of a dead lamb hanging down between her legs. Jilly had been struggling God knows how long to give birth to that lamb while I was sleeping on the straw. I put goose grease all over my hands, and I reached in to Jilly. She was bone dry, and I know I hurt her. I know I hurt her when I pulled that lamb out. She just lay there in the barn, as motionless as death. I called the shepherd, the old one. He came and he saw what had happened. He said she would die. He said, she's given up. Sheep don't fight. That's why they need shepherds. Well, I began to cry then, both for Jilly and for myself. And old Ralph, he turned around then and he came back. Well, he said, maybe there's one thing. What? I said. What? He said, people say that sheep like music. And it's true, they do. So you might try singing. Well, I sang all the rest of that spring day and into the night. I sang over and over and over. God be with you, my heavenly sheep. Humble me, Jilly, and heal in thy sleep. Now, that was a song to the Virgin Mary, but I changed the words. And I sang until the stars came out. God bless ye, Jilly, my heavenly sheep. Do not forsake me, and heal in thy sleep. As the stars grew dim, I kept checking her breathing. I probably checked 100 times. And I put my hands in her fleece. Finally, the moon was setting and there was some dew on the grass. Best of all of the flock that I tend, my lamb, my Jilly, my sweetheart, my friend. Oh, Jilly, my lambkin, my heavenly sheep, lullaby, lolly, and heal in thy sleep. I was getting so hoarse. I couldn't sing anymore, and I was shivering all over. And so I got up and lay right next to Jilly, and I put my arm over her and my head on her fleece, and I fell asleep. And I must have slept awfully well, because she escaped from my arms. When the sun shone into my eyes and the sky was all red with morning, I looked outside the barn, and there was Jilly, cropping that beautiful yellow-green spring grass. That's Alice the Shepherdess by Laura Amy Schlitz. She won a Newbery for that story of that book of stories about medieval people in 2008. Well, years and years and years ago, before the cafe was the beautiful, sound perfect place that it is today, waiting for all of you to come back and fill it up. Lena did her Christmas show all by herself. Now, some of you probably watched last year's Christmas show because there are too many people on the stage, and although Lena's is live streaming, they couldn't have all those people on the stage. So those of you who watched the Christmas show saw last year's Christmas show. But when Lena used to do her Christmas show all by herself, she did the whole of A Child's Christmas in Wales. And when I think of Lena doing A Child's Christmas in Wales, I can still see the way her face looked when she was being the little boy talking to the sort of impatient Dylan Thomas voiced person. Because of Lena, I learned all of A Child's Christmas in Wales, and I did it a few times, and I loved it, and I always listened to it. So I'm going to tell you just a teeny part of A Child's Christmas in Wales tonight. I remember we went carol singing once when there wasn't the tiny shape of a moon to light the flying streets. At the end of a long road, there was a driveway that went up to a large house. And the four of us stumbled up that drive in the darkness, each one of us afraid. Each one of us with a stone in his pocket, just in case. And all of us too brave to say a word. The wind made noises as of old and unpleasant, and maybe web-footed men wheezing in caves. We reached the black bulk of the house. What shall we give them? Hark the herald? No, said Jack. Good King Wenceslas, I'll count 3. 1, 2, 3. And we began to sing, our voices high and seemingly distant in that snow-felted darkness that surrounded that house that was occupied by nobody we knew. We stood close together by the dark door. Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, when the snow lay round about, deep and then a small, dry voice joined our singing. A small voice like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a long time. A small, dry, eggshell voice. A small, dry voice through the keyhole, and when we stopped running, we were outside our house again. And, the front room was lovely. The balloons were floating over the hot water bottle gulping gas, and everything was good again and shone over the town. Perhaps it was ghosts, said Jim. Perhaps it was trolls, said Dan, who was always reading. Let's go in and see if there's any jelly left, said Jack. And we did that. The reason that I picked this little part of A Child's Christmas in Wales is because although I grew up in Iowa and there was all the snow and the cold and the cats and many things that Dylan Thomas talks about, this part most imitated my experience of Christmas caroling as a child in Farmers Chapel Methodist Church. It was a country Methodist church, and we had an MYF group, Methodist Youth Fellowship, and at Christmas time, we always went Christmas caroling. And of course, we were in the country, so we couldn't walk from house to house like we do when we Christmas carol in Saratoga. And crazy people in Saratoga open their doors and stand there with the cold coming in. And we went around in cars. And I have no memory of stopping at any of our parents' houses to sing. We went, we probably did, but what I remember the most were stopping at the houses of what our leaders called then shut-ins. And that meant that we drove on long, strange roads, up driveways, and we got out of cars at houses that hadn't seen paint in a long time. They all had porches, as I remember, and they had just barely a light bulb on the porch, and maybe there was light and maybe there wasn't inside the house. It was all so scary to me. And when we finished singing, we would run back to the cars as fast as we could. And the boys in MYF, these boys I had grown up with since we were little kids, even though I went to one country school and they went to another one. And they were like my, I didn't have any brothers, but that's what they were like to me. But by the time we were in junior high, evidently the girls were not like sisters to them, and those boys would run and push each other to try and get into the cars next to us, and I don't need to tell you what they tried to do in the cars, and I just hated it. But when we got back to the church, we didn't go in and see if there was any jelly left. But we did go in and have a big pot of chili and real homemade cocoa with those big fat marshmallows floating in the top. So May you have real cocoa, marshmallows or not. May you have chili if you like it. And may we meet again soon, crowded together, healthy and strong, here at Caffe Lena. But before we can do that, come again on the 4th Tuesday for the January live stream. Thank you, Caffe Lena, for keeping music and storytelling alive during this time. Thank you so much, Reese and Joe and Sarah and all the people who make this possible. And thank you, Betty and Sandy. It was a pleasure to be called in at the last minute and join you two. Thank you all. Good night.